Right, good morning, everyone. My name is Aaron Hartley. I'm Chief Exec of TAROE Trust. This morning, really pleased to be welcoming Dr Alison Wallace, who is going to be talking to us in relation to some really new research on innovations in property management and the use of remote sensors in the home. So I'll come back and introduce that a little bit further in a moment. Just a couple of logistics. As usual, we're using the Zoom webinar function. There's the chat function that's available for everybody to use when Alison's going through her presentation. I'll be monitoring that in the background. Alison's presentation is going to be about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have opportunity to have a kind of a discussion on the issues that they've identified and was emerged from the research that Alison and her team were doing. So it's great to have you all here today. We've got about an hour and a quarter, but we'll probably be about an hour today. It might be a little bit shorter today's session. Any immediate questions that anyone's got before we kind of kick off? Okay, so yeah, as I said, we're joined by Dr Alison Wallace. Alison is the senior lecturer in social policy and housing at the University of York, and they've just relatively recently completed some research into the use of remote sensors to detect damp and mould in tenants' properties. So Alison's going to outline the research itself, some of the findings and some of the issues that came out, as I've just said. In particular, though, I'd be really interested, and I know Alison would be really interested in tenants' views of the use and application of sensors in the home, and as to whether you feel that they were monitoring the property or the people, and whether there are any kind of issues that need to be taken into account. So yeah, Sandy?
Yeah, I think that was one of the most important things about the sensors in the homes. What will you be monitoring, how you'll monitor it, and what you're going to do when you find humidity levels are too high and tenants don't have the money. But I'm sure that's a question that will come up.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And Julie?
Yeah, I'm currently going through all of this. I couldn't believe my luck when I found that there was actually somebody with all this knowledge and experience to help me out. But I've become quite knowledgeable on the process of this, and I've had some strange and unusual opportunities to gather knowledge on it by total fluke, as life does. And I've currently got these sensors just having been fitted in my home.
Oh, right.
And I'm aware that the association hasn't told anybody that these sensors monitor them, and I've got this, I can't help it, I'm a very blunt Yorkshire woman, I'll say it as I've said it to them. I don't like paying to rent a home to be their lab rat, because I don't. And I think when the world is so harsh outside, when you come to your front door, that's your home, it's your lock myself away from the world, be normal, be me. And I feel like I'm just part of their experiment. And I think if they didn't think people would feel like this, why were they so secretive and not told one person that's had it fitted that that's what they're doing, monitoring them? And I spent a couple of days with the people from Switchy.
Oh, yeah.
And they explained everything that they can monitor, how much data they gather, to what degree they can tell you things.
That's really, really interesting, Julie, and I think that's echoed, not particularly in this study because it was explained to people and things, but these items are being rolled out in some instances without sort of preliminary engagement with the tenants, and I think that's one of the important learning outcomes of it. And it happened in York Council, where the company had only given the council a few sensors and issued their own press release to the local paper without the landlord having an opportunity to even talk to the tenants. And obviously all uproar ensued, and they didn't go ahead with it because people were like thinking they were going to be monitored for the bedroom tax, and you know, in terms of you can see how many people are in the property and things, or you get an idea of the occupancy and what have you. So yes, I think there are important pointers about how these sensors are rolled out.
So we've already seen some important issues in terms of the context of this around ethics and communication. I know Hannah's going to just say one thing, and then we'll hand over to Alison to hear her presentation. So Hannah.
Yeah, just very quickly to say, I'll send Darren over chapter 6 of my thesis, which is also another piece of research that looks at these sensors as well. So you can see what I wrote on that, and I'm also going to be writing a reaction piece to this as well. That's going to be on LinkedIn. So if you don't already follow TAROE on LinkedIn, put something, you know, follow us there, and you'll see more of my thoughts on that. But I just want to say I was so excited that the University of York have been doing this research, because I think it's so important these conversations happen. But I'll stop talking now.
Okay, shall I share my screen?
Yeah, please, if you can. And I'm going to mute everyone. Apologies. It's just so that we can hear, Alison.
All right. Can you see that all right?
Yeah, that looks good, Alison. Great. Yeah. Brilliant.
Okay, well, thank you again for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. We're already got the bones of a really interesting discussion going, so that's really good. So I did this project the year before last with my colleagues here from the University of York and Leeds, and it was a government initiative giving some money to a local authority to try out these new technical innovations in all sorts of areas, and they were working with these companies who, one of which wanted to evaluate, you know, what was happening. So that's how we became involved. So let me just here we go. Yeah. So what I wanted to talk to you about is go through some of these sorts of developments in terms of the what the industry likes to call prop tech, you know, all this digital innovation in the property world, how that can relate to social housing and health, as just a bit of a background to the study, and tell you a little bit about how we went about doing it, what these sensors are doing in people's homes, and provide some insight into the lived experience of people with damp, mould and cold, and what they thought of the internal monitoring of their air quality and humidity and temperatures and things. And it points to the potential, but also some of the sort of limitations of these innovations. So that's what we'll be talking about. So the first thing, the system that we were considering was based on what they call the Internet of Things linked environmental sensors. So the Internet of Things is all sorts of things that might be linked to sort of cloud computing. So it could be your Alexa or your Ring doorbell, you know, that is wirelessly connected, that you can look up, you know, films of who come to your door or who pinched your milk or whatever, things like this. In this situation, we're talking about sensors that are installed in your home that connect, that wirelessly send information back to the landlord about temperature, humidity and carbon dioxide and different configurations of these things, because they can identify environments that are at risk of cold, damp and mould and other pollutants like dust mites as well. They can identify rapid heat loss in the building and the number of air changes and things. CO2 is like carbon dioxide is almost a proxy of just air quality. If there's high concentrations of CO2, then it's likely there's also high concentrations of other indoor pollutants, air pollutants. But other sensors can also be attached to these systems that could measure nitrous oxide, I think it's called, or nitrogen dioxide, and also PN numbers, the pollutants that come from cars and traffic and things like that. But we were just looking at cold, damp and mould in particular, but other things could be measured. And the system wirelessly sends back this information to the landlord's dashboard, which is shown here. And it shows individual property, individual rooms, but then can also zoom out and you can look at the data across your whole portfolio of people's homes. So you can inform immediate action. So like a red traffic light, if it flags up red, that demands immediate action. It could be orange, that is something to note and get round to doing quite shortly, or it might be green, in which case it's okay. And that can be integrated with what the landlord knows about the properties anyway. When these homes last had proper double glazing installed, or have they had been retrofitted for recently, or have they had new heating systems and what have you, as well as what we know about the occupants that the tenant might have on the record, although that's that could be a bit out of date. But these data can be added to other data to increase the insight into the problems, and they can operate quite sort of sophisticated data analytics on these things. What's in development as well, which is shown on the left there, is a tenant app that people can look at on their mobiles or tablets and things. And here it has depicts a home, with different colours. So again, the green, orange or red, but also whether it's a smiley face or a sad face or just a sort of neutral face. And it can prompt tenants to, if it's flagging up the bathroom humidity is too high, it might prompt them to open a window. For this pilot scheme, the sensors were put in the living room, kitchens and bathrooms, because there were some sensitivities about putting the sensors in bedrooms, which we'll sort of come back to. But it could sort of, as I said, prompt tenants to open windows or to turn the heating up. But as somebody's already flagged, that could be an issue. But the platform and the data display all these analytics, and that's the actual product, is this software rather than the sensors. The sensors are quite cheap and are made by all different manufacturers. It's how the data that is transmitted back to this platform and how it's analysed and things, that is the actual product. And as we've touched on, these things are being rolled out across social housing, probably more so in the last couple of years than when I actually did the study, given that the events with the little boy losing his life due to mould and respiratory disease in Rochdale, and the ombudsman and things and the regulator getting a bit tougher on social landlords. But this was what we were operating with a company called HomeLink. They're part of a company called ACO, who have relations with many social landlords, because they deal with lots of sort of fire safety issues and things. So they're a big player in that space. As I was saying, these technologies are being rolled out, and that will be accelerated now because of the sort of more strident and muscular approach from the particularly the ombudsman, but also the regulator in changing the consumer standards and things. and we can see why this has sort of become a problem over recent years. We've seen improvements in damp, mould and cold homes stalled in the last few years amongst housing associations and local authorities. These charts show the decline in problems related to damp, cold and mould in the English Housing Survey for local authorities in blue and housing associations in orange. So we can see, like, sort of from 2011 onwards, there was, you know, vast improvement, and then that just tailed off really ever since then. But what we have seen, there was some reduction in repairs expenditure that accompanied the rent in decrease. If you remember, there was a 1% rent cut that the government imposed on social landlords, and so repairs expenditure went down. Since then, we've actually seen repairs expenditure go up, but that's being spent on that had up until now had been spent on fire safety remediation after Grenfell, but also eco matters, which may or may not help in some of these instances. Obviously, with the heightened public gaze on social landlords and damp and mould and cold, you know, hopefully there's a big uptick in expenditure on these issues in the most recent data when that comes through. But why it's so important, though, as well, is that we know that housing is a major determinant of health outcomes. Poor housing costs the NHS 1.4 billion a year. There's lots and lots of evidence about the impact of damp, mould and cold, or dust mites, or poor indoor air quality in terms of carbon dioxide and things on residents' health. So there's it impacts on colds and asthma, especially for children, but also on cardiovascular issues, and also really contributes to people's mental ill health. It produces can produce such a low mood, and also reduce people's ability to socialise and things in their homes. But budget constraints across public services over the last decade or so have meant that all public services really are looking for quick digital solutions to make services more effective and save money on operational costs, as well as to try and achieve better outcomes. And that's the same in the health service, the same as in housing. So the health service, you know, we've seen lots of great innovation. There was a report recently about artificial intelligence and these sort of superpowered computer programs identifying mammograms, looking, you know, much more efficiently looking for breast cancer in mammograms, but also targeting areas where radiotherapy goes for cancer, and as well as other sort of diagnostic and dispensing things. But in housing, it's the same. I was at the Housing Summit conference last week in Manchester, and you really saw loads and loads of stands offering innovation, digital sort of services and innovations to housing. So, you know, and that sort of brings us on to what developments in this space, because we there's lots of writing to say that we're sort of in the midst of this great data revolution, that we are having another sort of what do they call it, like an industrial revolution 4.0, someone's called it, where we've had with more and more services becoming being on computers and things, we've got this use of great admin data sets, the use of big data from every time we buy something online, every time we engage with our utility companies or public services, or just all that landlord data they've got. Their computing power now is so advanced that they can really make use of these really huge data sets to have greater insight about our lives and things. And this is all happening in the housing field. There's lots of literature about the automated landlord, where you can, you know, we know we can book a short-term letting from Airbnb without having any humans involved whatsoever, you know, when there's a key entry system at the door. But that sort of platforms where we book things and do things is being rolled out to residential housing as well in the private rented sector. And there's developments in America where you can search for a home, you can go and view a home, you can sign for the tenancy, you can pay your rent, report your repairs without any sort of human involvement and things. And there's also sorts of developments where landlords are using digital technologies to monitor door entry system, who's coming, who's going, whose homes are being visited the most, and things like this, which you know, we can talk about. But you know, there was lots of those sorts of stands at the Housing Summit last week as well. But on the other hand, there's also lots of concern about some of these sorts of technologies reinforcing some bias. So whose homes are being monitored with these door entry systems, watching who's coming and going? I haven't got that on my front door. And how do people feel about that? There may be benefits. Some people may feel extraordinarily under surveillance. There's also things about whether use in other public services of like the risk of reoffending, or using these big data sets and automated systems to prioritize who gets child welfare interventions when there's not enough social workers to go around and things. So but there's concerns in the literature about how some of these systems can be a bit biased, and they can reinforce some of the inequalities in life, because they're taking data that includes all of these life inequalities, and rather than challenging it, they just amplify it. So there are some issues, but there's also lots of developments to say, like some of the medical things I mentioned, you know, that how do we harness all these technologies for the public good, because they can be very transformational, and they'll change how we do all sorts of things. They're already changing how we shop, what our high streets look like. They'll change the way we engage with public services from health and also housing. How it'll all turn out, we don't know, but there's obviously big moves to try and make these changes equitable and be used for the public good, not just to make more money for companies and things. So we were happy to engage in this study. It started out, it was going to evaluate, talk to the tenants and talk to staff and things before the census were involved, and then also afterwards. But that didn't happen because the funding was cut, but such is life, especially at the moment. But what we did manage to achieve was a really interesting small survey with tenants. We've got the data from the census, from 49 people had the census installed in their homes, and we had some really, really rich interview discussions with 17 tenants as well. And it's that I want to tell you about now. So the people that we talked to had similar profiles to other social landlord, you know, social tenant profiles. There was more women, more people with ill health, more single people, slightly more, and more white people in our survey than they were across the national average. But that probably just reflects the city that we were working in. Slightly fewer were struggling with their rent, again, could because it's up north and not in London, say, so just a geographical issue. But we did also have more struggling with their energy bills than average, but again, it was up north. We have lots of weather up north. We had an awful lot of people, obviously it was a self-selecting survey, not a so it wasn't always representative, but we had an awful lot of people reporting that they had damp or hard to heat homes, or that they had problems with external repairs to their windows and roofs and things. Now these numbers of people experiencing damp and hard to heat homes is way in excess of what the English Housing Survey reports about cold and damp homes, but that, you know, that is an issue in itself, in that to what the survey that the government data often is based on just has serious damp and mould, but then we don't really know what an acceptable level, if there is one at all, of damp and mould is. The World Health Organization say, you know, that there isn't an acceptable level, it hasn't been determined. So these are just as valid representations of you know, people's experiences as the government surveys. But we also had a lot of people, so with damp and mould, hard to heat, we also had people with lots of different expressions of fuel poverty as well. So nearly 2/3 of people were cutting back on bills, cutting back on their heating, how many rings they used on their stove. They were cutting back, retreating into single rooms because they couldn't afford to heat their whole homes and things. So that was really high. And we also had half of the people had energy ratings that were acceptable. That is the aim, that we have everybody within A to C. But that meant that we also had a big portion of people who didn't have homes that were of an acceptable level. But as you can see here, this local authority had a good portion of energy efficient homes compared to nationally. Let's talk about what the tenants told us, and you can see some of the quotes here about people discovering mould behind their sofa and wondered why they'd all of a sudden developed asthma and things, and also about people being sort of what they called, you know, saying being fobbed off. Right, if you report damp, the culture to date has always been, oh, just open your window, you know, you need to let the moisture out, without really investigating what was going on. And also about how tenants were really putting a lot of effort in themselves to try and manage these situations, spending money on dehumidifiers and what have you, to try and manage the problems themselves. But I think that this is some of the strength of the study, that it gives voice to tenants who've been in these circumstances. So people talked about the effort they put in, that frequently being told that they were the problem and not their home. And when the landlords did take action, sometimes it was really piecemeal. So if somebody was reporting a really bad damp and mouldy problem in the bathroom, they came, cleaned the mould off, put anti-fungicidal paint up, but didn't actually fix the broken extractor fan. And those sorts of things were sort of repeated a few times. And it took a lot of persistence, and tenants were really tenacious in trying to chase up the landlord to try and get them to act. With some, like an elderly woman, actually in a sheltered housing as well, taking up to 2 years to be told, oh, we've got damp and mould, to have a new damp proof course put in. So there was a genuinely serious problem when she'd just been told to, you know, open her windows and things. but that effort in chasing the landlord just wasn't, that the energy to do that wasn't available to all the tenants we spoke to. So you saw that they were carrying a big sort of health burden. There was a lot of people who had ill health, and they just didn't have that emotional energy to keep chasing the landlord, and that left them feeling very disempowered and disrespected. But a third of our tenants also reported that they had cold homes, and it was and these are some of the quotes from them about it was really hard to heat, and the financial consequences of that. There's also health consequences of cold homes. So people who had arthritis, these people had had a plates put in where they'd had broken bones, and it sort of really exaggerated the pain that they felt. There was also people who just had really, really cold houses and were just occupying the tiny sort of what do you call it, the box room above the front door in the house, because it was the smallest room, it was easier to heat, and the impact on the mental health was and how they felt about themselves was profound. So but some of the issues related to odd building archetypes that councils had, with cold spots in roofs. There were certain types of buildings that were problematic. There were also associated, because people had old, even now in it was 2021 when we did the field work, had old electric storage heaters, didn't even have modern central heating systems still, and they found them really uncontrollable. And that people had, as I said, expressions of fuel poverty, staying in bed, limited socialising, and not doing too much to put pressure on family budgets. So this was before the cost of living crisis. It's before the fuel energy costs that we've had this winter, and it was before food inflation costs that we've had. So how these people have got on now, we can only imagine, but I do think about them often, about how they've got on. The council did have support for energy and had energy advisors, but their support was really seemed to be confined to supporting switching suppliers and getting better deals for people. Although we did have the council also upgrading some of the older heating systems as well. But when we could put the premise of the study, which was quite interesting, was always on changing the tenants' behaviour. So it tells you a lot about the culture up until now, which has been told to change. But you can say the culture of the sector, that the blame is on the tenants and not that they're not managing their homes properly, rather than there being a problem with the building. And this is also despite evidence in government surveys that occupant behaviour has little bearing on damp and mould, and that cold homes were often related to income and occupancy in the damp, mould and cold, or income and occupancy levels, so how many people are in the building breathing and showering and things, rather than related to property energy efficiency alone. And the survey reinforced these issues as well. Some of the key associations that we found with tenants who reported damp and mould was their household size. So as I said, how many people were eating, breathing, sleeping, cooking, all these things that put moisture in the air. The more people there were, obviously the more moisture there is, but also their income source, if they were working rather than on benefits, which is sort of counterintuitive, but we'll come back to that. And also whether they had some indicators of fuel poverty, and also indicators of repairs needed doing to their roof. With hard to heat homes, that 33% of people reported, what was associated with those was about drafts and insulation being poor, that they had damp and mould was also associated with hard to heat homes, but also the indicators of fuel poverty. What wasn't apparent in the data was about tenant behaviours, about drying, washing indoors, not opening windows. All these things weren't statistically significant. So I think that's quite interesting. So what we have is about household size, work. So the higher the number of occupants, the more likely they were to have damp and mould. The working was interesting because that was associated with heating your home intermittently. If you're in all day, you're likely to have the heating on, however, a low level all day. If you're working, not so much, so that the house was being left and the surface is getting cold, so damp and mould could grow. So I thought those things were interesting. So again, tenant behaviours, that was the premise of the whole funding package, didn't come out as statistically significant at all. When you look at the proportion of people who dry washing indoors, it's loads of the population dry washing indoors, but we also, tenants didn't always have drying areas or anywhere or balconies, for example. So the option of doing it differently wasn't available. It is a small survey, but it did back up the larger things that we found, the larger literature. So the sensors, when it comes to them, we had 49 people volunteered to have the sensors in their home, and they had, unlike Julie, who sort of had them imposed on them, or the example from York that people thought they were just going to have them. The people who volunteered had the whole thing explained to them. We had lots of, I apologise. We had lots of Zoom calls explaining what it was all about, and they had WhatsApp groups of questions and with the company, and regular check-ins with them to talk about problems and things. The company also gave them a tablet so that they could use the tenant app as well, and things. But what we found here is that of the 49 homes, half of them, 24 homes, had a high risk of having damp and mould. And 11 had a medium risk. So we had, so these sensors were more sensitive, reported problems, potential problems more often than the tenants did, which I thought was quite interesting, because they're identifying things before they might happen, saying there's a risk here rather than there is an actual problem. So that was quite interesting. What we also found, that was very, very few cold homes, but the way that when we thought about that, it just meant that there was lots of homes with rapid heat loss. You can see here 6 came out high, 33 came out of medium risk, so 80%, but not very many cold ones, which meant this is where the tenants were paying lots and lots of money to heat their homes. So they did heat their homes, but they would have been paying more, using more energy to do so. We also found risks of dust mites, where we have warm, humid conditions in some people's flats. And that's a risk, as we said, for asthma and things, and also for CO2, and that can be really problematic, especially for older people. The air quality not being circulated and changed, so that is an issue. And if you think about, if you scale up these findings across a stock of sort of 50,000, however big your landlord is, you can see that you could help landlords prioritise interventions across stock, investigate the high ones, but even think about how they spend their money on their homes to alleviate some of these things. There was a high accordance between what the tenants were telling us and the sensor data as well. And so what we were thinking, the sensors were really useful because they picked up not just physical property attributes, does it have double glazing, is it insulated and things, but also because of it's also measuring humidity and things, and it can also tell whether the extract fans are working, whether the air changes are going and things, or whether people are opening windows. It also has that sort of balance between capturing issues of occupancy and issues to do with the property. So that's an extra layer of insight that the sensors can tell landlords. So you can see that they could use it in a valuable way to invest in their stock. As I say, in the start, engaging with the staff was a bit problematic. They weren't very on board with the pilot project, because I think it was the IT department who'd signed them up for it, and the motivation hadn't come from housing, so they were a bit difficult to engage. But when we did have a focus group with them, again the emphasis was on tenant education, and it took a manager to step in to say, well, actually, after lots of prompting, to say, well, actually there are some problems where the tenants aren't to blame and it's the property. But it did really reflect the culture in the sector that the Ombudsman has been highly critical of. But what we also found from tenants, in particular, from the surveys and the interviews, that maybe because the company had done all the preliminary work with them and not just given them to them like Julie, the tenants and the survey people were largely on board with having the sensor technology installed into their homes, although some of them, especially in the survey, had not really thought about the issues before. So I would characterize their views as being weakly held. If you sort of challenged them or asked them another question or thought of it from a different way, they might change their minds, if you see what I mean. But what came through was that there was a real opportunity to change the conversations tenants were having with landlords, because they saw that this new extra neutral almost source of evidence could help back up their claims of there being a problem in their home, and to try they thought that extra data could help them get the service they needed from their landlord. So that was that was quite that came through quite loud. I think 70%, I'm just looking at the data, I think about 70% were quite comfortable with the sensors being installed. Obviously there are some people who weren't sure, but not all of those people were. I think there was a very limited, only 9% were against, and they were mostly pensioners or people on benefits, but 74% were comfortable. We found tenants were actually quite well digitally connected. Only 7% weren't digitally connected, but it didn't mean that they were all confident using digital technology. So the app, a lot of support went into getting tenants to how they could use the app and things, and the company were working with the tenants to try and make it as friendly as possible to use. So that was interesting. Only 17%, well, 17% of people didn't have broadband, so that the app was be difficult to use for them, even if they were given a tablet or had a mobile phone. But it didn't stop the sensors working, because they used a different network. What was interesting and needs explored a lot more was about what landlords do with the data. So 73% agreed with that data sharing with the landlords was all right. They felt it was the property being evaluated and measured. They knew it wasn't listening to them or recording the conversations, although we sort of had lots of funny conversations about that, but they knew it was sort of the property. But there is an element there of it measuring the people as well, because as I was saying, you could tell with the higher occupancy meant higher humidity often. But an absence of humidity, landlords could also tell whether the people had abandoned the home or whether they'd been empty. But sharing that sort of data was possible, but there was an agreement not to use it in this. It wasn't looking for occupancy in that way. We were just looking for the relevance to damp, mould and cold. But there were scenarios where you can imagine it being really beneficial. So for an old person, if they'd fallen on the floor or there'd been an issue, or we're talking about these awful situations where somebody's been found in their home dead or something, that you've been reported in the news, you could see that if it came out that there was nothing being used, there wasn't any humidity or breathing or what have you, that it could be done. But tenants resisted sharing the data really with other agencies like especially social services, but health people as well. Although the local public health were really interested in this because it does monitor the health of the building. So public health officials were really interested in it. But I think how this data is shared and who the data belongs to are blurred areas that needs more detailed work. So some people did sort of think they wouldn't want to share it with anyone, but if you said, what if it's an old person living in a really cold home, that could, you can imagine that being shared positively, and then somebody intervening to say, you know, could they help? And then some people changed their minds, but not everybody. So anyway, there's more work to explore about who owns the data, who it could be shared with or without permission and things. So I think some of these things point to some of the potential, but as some of the problems as well. So as I said, tenants were largely supportive. They didn't really think they were the subject of surveillance, which was our initial suspicion. When we started the project, we thought people might feel under surveillance. They liked the tenant app that was giving them information, although whether that interest wears off after time, you can imagine, you know, when you get your smart meter from the electric, you look at how much the green and the red bars are going, and then after a while you put them in the drawer and forget about it. So whether that interest wears off after a while, we're not sure. But tenants and staff did recognise the potential in informing the repairs and maintenance strategies for landlords. It would really help them target interventions, not just on who's got double glazing and who's got new window or new heating systems, but you know, where are the risks that they're going to have adverse impacts on people as well, you know, and then you could prioritise interventions there. But the tenants as well, they thought they've viewed the data as a neutral arbiter in disputes with the landlord, and the potential of that really did put the bejesus up the landlord, is one way of saying it. And so much so that the landlord had to write into the contract with the company that the data could, and with the tenants, the privacy notice, that the data obtained through this pilot study could not be used in any other circumstances, such as disrepair claims and the courts, because that potential is there for them. But that's why the tenants liked it. But also there's a lot of data that can be used, but there are limits on the ability of both tenants and landlords to do anything about it in terms of affecting people's benefits, their ability. They're in fuel poverty. They can insulate the home, but they can't make the benefits any higher, whatever. People can't do anything about their household size if they're overcrowded and waiting for a larger home, or if their wages aren't much and things, that they're beyond the tenants and the landlord's control. But what can be done, obviously, is that, you know, the homes can be improved as much as possible, and landlords are in a position to signpost and signal and help people access ways to improve the other parts of their lives as well. But I think it shows it really shows that as we sort of signaled at the beginning, the deployment of these sensors is much more complex than just rolling them out, putting them in everybody's homes without having a conversation about them, which I know I've seen in inside housing that some landlords are doing. There's a lot more to be worked out, and about how they're going to fit in with tenants, how they're going to fit in with landlords, current operational services. Are they going to refer them for rehousing or to help them increase their benefits and things like this? But also we saw how sensitive the sensors were to identifying homes at risk. Are landlords going to really, in the current circumstances, have the capacity to actually fulfill all the risks that these sensors highlight, which is also an issue. Obviously, they're diverting funding to address damp and mould, and they all have to draw up strategies and send them to the ombudsman and things. But it's still, that's still all those sorts of operational things would need to be sorted out. And as I've said, the data ownership in practice is quite unclear. This company, at the end of the pilot session, the data would be sort of deleted and things, but you could see how companies could monetize the data and tell them about performance of different landlords' properties and sort of repackage it and sell it back to them and insights back to them. So we don't really know how all these different companies and things are managing in this space. So just to sort of conclude that the pilot scheme was really positive, but for a number of reasons, it wasn't straightforward. So we did think it could signal some sort of ominous surveillance of tenants and things, but that wasn't really the case. Very few people had those sorts of views, but they weren't deeply held views because this is very new technology to them. But it did signal that all these sort of technologies and data platforms could be used for sort of good purposes, as well as sort of just to make more money or to save landlords money. It could help tenants, and they really felt it could just change the tenor of the conversations tenants were having with landlords in this disputed space. But really, I think we need more studies to look at how these sensors are rolled out, how they're tenants are experiencing the use, whether they're getting anywhere better with the landlords because they've got the sensors involved, how landlords are using them, and how all this is done at scale. Also, if there's cost savings arising from the use of these data, who are they going to? Are they going to the landlord, or is it helping tenants with, with some of those fuel poverty things? But also, are there any health benefits as well? That was the sort of one of the other important issues underpinning the project. Can we use these sensors to make homes healthier for people? But as I said, there are limitations with the current funding systems and things. So can tenants actually affect change with things, and can social landlords? Because we're not going to have fewer overcrowded homes or higher wages or higher benefits anytime quickly and things. But I'll just come to the end now and give the last word to the tenants, as this quote doesn't tell you the whole story, because this person had respiratory problems and it took them a very long time for them to tell me this through their coughing and wheezing and things. But he was really supportive of them, because he was just sick of being fobbed off about his cold, drafty house, and he really felt that the data from the sensors would give the tenants greater ammunition, as it were, greater sort of strength to back up their experiences and stories with the landlord. So that's it. Sorry, I've gone over time. I sort of rambled.
Thank you, Alison. As always, really very informative, and so much to so much to go through. I mean, there's been a lot of comments, a lot of chat in the chat function as we've been going through, and which you've probably not seen. And some of those things, as you've been going through, have actually been addressing some of the issues and questions that have been raised as in the chat function. I mean, I think for me to kind of my takeaway from that is that it's clear that there are significant benefits that can be derived from the use or installation of technology within people's homes, and that those benefits could result in efficiencies and savings, which could be reinvested into further investment in the properties or in services and so forth. What seems to be common here, which is kind of commonplace more generally in technology, and we can see this is both the pace of change of the technology and the understanding of that pace of change and the kind of infrastructure that goes around it. So when I talk about infrastructure, I'm thinking like the legal infrastructure struggles to keep up, doesn't it, with just modern forms of technology. So it raises all of those issues about who owns the data, how is that data used, who is that data shared with, how do you use that data, and then of course is that if we've not even got clarity over those things, is then the whole thing about, well, can forces be used in order to make use or to like monetize that data in some way, to gain advantage in some way. So it's that whole thing, isn't it, about being informed and then following being informed, the control of those. So who does it belong to? Who's the data belong to? Who has the choice over the rollout of this? And one of the things that came which made me think as we were going through is that there wasn't a lot of information in what you said about even how, or maybe I missed it, but there didn't appear to be, about how the properties were actually selected. Because for me, the starting point would be, actually, we've got this as potential technology that could have benefits. Let's have a conversation with tenants. Who wants to get involved in this? Who wants to be able to kind of potentially derive some benefits, and can you help work through some of these sort of challenges that we've got at the same time about the application and the use of it more generally? Are you able to say, before we kind of like open it up, are you able to say any more for that about the kind of the selection of these?
This was very much advertised to tenants, and tenants volunteered for it. So there was people with an interest in it, either because they had damp or mould, or because they were being sort of altruistic and had spare time and would like to be involved in the pilot. So that it was opened up to anybody of their stock, of their amongst their tenants. So but as we know, that isn't how they're being rolled out in other places. So that's what I very much not quite co-produced, but a high degree of engagement with tenants in this pilot from the company, who put a lot of effort in and were genuinely keeping them on board. So they had like Facebook groups, WhatsApp groups to talk about the app and to talk about their experiences and things, and they did get the landlord to respond because of data from the that the sensors were put in. One person in particular did work for them and things, but of course, as I said, the money was curtailed, so I don't know what happened afterwards, unfortunately.
So it's interesting that it was kind of tenants that volunteered to take part, because you would imagine, therefore, they're the kind of the ones that are pro or wanting to get involved. There was still I think you said something about 70-something% that was kind of like positive.
Yeah, so that was the people who were involved in having the sensors installed, and then we invited wider people to fill out a survey, but there was less engagement with the survey, as there is with lots of social surveys now, unfortunately. So we had 156 people, so it's still a lot of people's opinions. We had quite detailed responses, so whatever, 77% of people were quite on board with it and made positive noises about it. It was mostly the others were don't knows. There was only 7 or 9% of people who weren't on board with it because they feared different things or whatever.
Thanks for clarifying that, Alison. I've got loads of questions, some of which came up from the chat, but I'm aware that Sandy's had her hand up and being very patient, so it shouldn't just be me dominating things. So Sandy.
Okay, I totally agree about the data side of it. That really does need to come into the fore. We all need to understand that. It's very important. The one thing that stuck with me was I was on a NFA webinar, and it was mainly with staff that were on, which was very good, by the way. And it was on sensors and not on sensors, but sensors came into it. And I did ask a question because at one point, somebody turned around and said, oh, well, the sensors is really good because what we can do is we can target the tenant. The word target for a start is absolutely horrible, very bad to use. So my question was, okay, so if you targeted a tenant because you'd realised their home humidity was going up too high, so you're going to phone them and tell them to turn up the heating. The answer was yes. My answer again was, okay, so what if that tenant turns around and says, I'm sorry, I can't put the heating on and throw my window open because I don't have the money? The answer was incredibly condescending. The answer to that question was, well, we always signpost people and there are heating vouchers, and it's like, good grief, which part of reality do you come from? How long do you think it takes somebody to apply for these things? And in the meantime, how many times are you going to phone that same tenant up and harass them before they've got the money to turn the heating on? So that's actually sort of stuck with me because that's only a couple of months ago. So that was my point.
I think I think it's a good point as well, because I think with all of these things, when we're thinking about using data and all the capabilities that we've got available to us now to prioritise children for child protection intervention, to think about reoffending, to think about these problem property conditions as well. Are we trying to use technology to solve problems of our own creation? You know, really, don't we just need more social workers? Don't we just need more funding or what have you for social housing and repairs and regenerating homes and things that we haven't?
Can I come back to that point? We've had, and it's not 30 years, it's well over 40 years with the amount of studies and books that have been written on this subject. Cold Comfort, the WHO have actually produced it 30 odd years ago. We've had an incredible amount. Nothing's been done. And as you said, in the last decade, it's gone down as for money being put into damp and mould and causes and remedies, which there are very few of. So is this not another way of targeting the tenants again and putting the blame back on the tenants? Well, now we can prove it. Now we've got the sensors to tell you. Actually, homes were built for living in, and we all want to live in them. You live in a home. Everybody here on this screen lives in a home. We all live in our homes differently, and we need to be able to live in them freely. We all breathe. We have pets, maybe. I mean, God forbid, we'll be banned from them next. But the point being, if the home is that unsuitable for a human being because it's not thermally efficient enough, where does that leave us tenants again?
I agree with you, Sandy, that, you know, this sort of underfunding has gone on for a long time, and they're almost, but the sensors within the narrow parameters of the circumstances and the financial situation and the organisational setup we have now, within those parameters, tenants were supportive in that they felt that they had this source of data that they could use to back up their arguments to say, it wasn't me, there is an actual issue here. Whether that is because they need rehomed, they need better heating, they need their extract fan fixed in the bathroom, whatever the issue is. So within those parameters, the sensors, I think, can help. As we've discussed, there are lots of issues about the deployment, how engaged the tenants are in those decisions, and about the data and what have you. But if we do step back from that, are sensors the issue, or do we have to change the parameters of the conversation in the way that you said, Sandy? Do we need to think about greater investment for people to make properties, actual people's homes, of good quality? And
absolutely, go back to doing the repairs in the first place and make the homes thermally efficient. Then think about introducing sensors, not just sticking them everywhere when the homes are not thermally efficient. So that would make a difference, and it would make a difference to the way the sensors are perceived. If we had homes that weren't leaky, if we didn't have thermal breaks and all the rest of it. So, and if the homes had been constructed properly. So yes, go back to doing the repairs and bringing those homes up for a thermally efficient standard first, then think about installing the sensors everywhere. Then you'll get a better and different result from tenants.
Yeah, I think one of the things it shows, though, is, isn't it, that the kind of the access and to data and the way that is used works both ways. And I think, and it comes back again to the control, but if it works both ways, we can see that there was some clear evidence that was coming out of the survey. Well, two things. One, that it was the tenant behaviours. I think Alison said something along the were showed as not statistically significant on all of those issues. And I think it's really important to remember that about when we're coming back to the kind of the lifestyle issues. The other bit is that it also showed that whilst there were various issues associated with the property condition, tenants could then have access to that, to evidence that A, it's not about their behavior, but B, there are some real structural issues, for instance, in the property to really add weight to maybe the landlord's priorities and for increased levels of investment in those properties. So Hannah had her hand up, and then Matthew. So Hannah first.
Oh, there's so much to say on this, and I won't. And I know I've had conversations with Darren about I really want to research this topic in terms of tenants' experiences. But I just want to say, in terms of the research that Alison has done, there's Alison's research and there's my thesis that really started looking at this. And I certainly found when I was doing my research, there was a bit of resistance as soon as questions started getting asked. And I think the point I wanted to make really is, think how political this conversation has gotten when we're talking about what is sold as quite a neutral measuring device that will help solve these problems. So thinking at it from that perspective, I think there's a potential desire of, there's a real benefit to identifying and revisiting what some of the causal problems are. Just the conversation we've had there about it being decades of lack of investment. If the home isn't safe enough to live in the first place, why do you need to put a sensor? There's all of these things are really quite politically charged, and there is an avoidance of that conversation. So the space where those conversations are going to happen is through independent research. So I want to say we definitely need more of that. And also give some credit as well to the companies who are engaging with these difficult questions as well. These technologies are new, they are advancing, and I can see some uses, certainly in terms of retrofit, new economic, new environmental changes in properties. If you can understand what's going on with the property, you can help people live in it better. yeah, there's so many questions about putting it in properties as tenants are describing that I think certainly need unpacking a lot more. I'll write a response piece to this. It'll be a very short one, but I just wanted to flag, just thanks so much for this, and how this is really new and under-researched, and I think there just needs to be more of a call for more independent research.
Thanks, Hannah. Matthew's been very patient. So we'll have Matthew, then Julie, and then we'll have to bring things to a close.
Right, thank you very much, Darren. So very quick introduction. I know some of you and some of you may know me, but I'm speaking as an ex-Housing Association Chief Executive who has now spent 3 years looking at the implications for tenants, for landlords, and the supply chain of the introduction of Internet of Things devices into properties. So my conclusions are that this stuff is going to happen. And in 10 years' time, this will be a discussion that happened 5 years ago. But it is a very, very important discussion to be having now. And I don't think that the landlords in the sector are generally approaching this in a very clever way. And I don't think the supply chain in the sector is approaching this in a generally very clever way. And that's because the person whose home these are going into is, generally speaking, neither being involved in the deployment of the sensors nor seeing any real benefit from their deployment. So I could go on for ages about what a good deployment would look like, and there are good deployments, and I really think there is huge benefit because it takes away plausible deniability. At the moment, one of the things that chief execs have is, I didn't know. Yeah, well, if you don't know, you have to act. You don't have to act. This takes away that plausible deniability, and that's the thing that for residents will become really, really important. My personal view, residents now should be getting together and demanding these devices. If you've got a landlord that isn't putting them in, why? I need this device, and we can go into the details of why that's the case. But you should also be making sure that the deployment of those devices is on fair terms, and that those terms are devised by landlords in conjunction with by residents in conjunction with the landlords, and are then taken and enshrined in some form of regulatory or ombudsman expectation. So if there was the regulatory backing for the approach that said that kind of the way that Julie explained at the beginning was not the way that you did it, then I think that a lot of protection would come through for residents about the possible downsides, and I accept there are some, of this technology, and it would be much, much easier to see and everybody to benefit from the upsides. My 2 pence.
Thanks, Matthew. I think there's a good structure there of Hannah's piece into the blog response as well. So thanks for that too. Julie, we've got about a minute, so
very brief. Just to say thank you to Matthew for that. That's really good input, and just to point out that there's going to be suspicion and a complete loss of trust when they're putting the cart before the horse, as it were, and they're putting these devices in before they fix the problems and before they've consulted. You're going to be suspicious of their motives, and then money is the bottom line here, I think. And that's how it feels to me. And I'm sorry, but once they've lost that trust, and that's the action they chose, and that's the manner they chose to do this in, it's going to be a long job before they convince me that there was any altruism in this. I think it's about bottom lines. And I think there's a big political question as to why we're in this state when other countries manage it far better than us. And the data that they get belongs to me, you know, and none of this has been discussed. So thank you for that.
Riff off Julie's point, and also Sandy's there about trust. There's questions in the academic literature about digital technologies are all about control. and trying to control real world complexity and have sort of hierarchical systems of accountability. There's a field of academic research which I'm looking at more called relational public policy, which is talking about more engaging with real world complexity and those interactions we have as human to human. And there is a real complexity to be asked about if we are relying more and more on technology to mediate these problems. Is a knock-on effect of that going to be a reduced trust in each other as human beings? And there's certainly some research that's emerging in terms of the use of digital technologies in other areas where that is proving to be the case. You also can't move away from the fact that the tenant-landlord relationship is an asymmetrical one, and it always will be. So who's got the power to name the problem is also a core issue here. So I think I'm not anti-technology, but I'm very cautious about the language of how it's used, certainly languages of inevitability, and we all have to adapt. Do we? Sounds a little bit, I don't know, non-democratic? Or are there other options in terms of more human ways of organising and having value in things? So sorry for going off on one bit. I've literally been reading papers in the background about this that have not yet been published because these debates are just happening in the academic world. But this has been thoroughly enjoyable, and also really, these conversations need to happen. This has been brilliant. There's so many different opinions and perspectives, all coming from independent research.
Thanks, Hannah. And I think that's a good point for us to close matters on today, the issue of trust. For those that are not aware, I sat on the Hackett review of post-Grenfell inquiry and the recommendations that came from that. And when I presented the resident voice findings as part of the conclusions of the investigation itself, I started and put the central theme of what was about trust and confidence, and that we've lost trust and confidence in the sector, and the programme which we need to start across the board in all areas is about trying to redevelop trust and confidence that we've got between tenants and landlords, and certainly that's the issue in relation to technology, which we can see here. But of course, we don't just blindly trust anybody, do we? That trust has to be developed and earned, and it's only through these conversations, through the independent research, and through the dialogue between the tenants and landlords about what is actually happening with people's homes that we can develop the trust as part of that process. So a big thank you to Alison for being able to come describe really important research and to enable us to have these conversations today. It sounds like we're just the start of the conversation, and that this is going to definitely go on for a number of years. Yeah, so really thankful, Alison. I think your presentation can also be shared as well, can't it? After today, so we'll send a link around to both this recording and the presentation when we've finished. We are back next week with our next webinar, which is big health warning. It's going to be not on our usual 11 a.m. slot. It's going to be 1:30 next Wednesday. We'll have Lisa Birchall and Brian Griffin, who will be coming to talk about the National Federation of Almo's most recent report on tenant scrutiny. And we'll also have our own hot off the press report, which will be released a couple of days ahead of that session too. So for those that are booked onto there, and I think there's over 50 already that are booked onto that session, look forward to seeing you there before our summer break. And a big thank you to all who joined today and made it to the end point. Hope to see you all again soon. Big thanks to Alison, and thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Alison. Thanks, everybody.